Well, I think by categorical art historical narratives, you mean the Western canon. And so how do we engage with that and the local? I think it would be better to recognize that there are multiple canons and that each canon has its own context and rules for the art, that no canon is more important than any other canon, that the Western art canon, for example, isn't better than the East German art canon, and to recognize that fact. And to recognize as well that the prominence of the Western canon has a lot to do with the prominence politically and economically of the West in the 20th and 21st centuries, and therefore we emphasize that one, but in actuality it's no more important than any of the other canons that are out there. And especially when we're looking at Central and Eastern Europe, it's a heterogeneous area. So we're talking not just one canon for Eastern and Central Europe, but as Peter Petrovsky argues, there's multiple canons there as well, with each of those individual countries having their own kind of system and set of rules and contexts. It's really a wide open field. In English language scholarship, very little has been published on East German art. And in terms of German scholarship, the scholarship since 1990 has really tended to be either a kind of a condemnatory approach or an apologetic approach. And there's been a real emphasis on political structures and on a top-down approach to East German art. And what we really need is to focus on the artists themselves and the artwork they created and how that artwork developed over time, how it relates to the context in which it was created. Another major area that I think needs to be done is looking eastward. We have a tendency, the studies of East German artists are always either just East Germany or looking at it comparatively with the West. And when you make that comparison with the West, you're always seeing the East as kind of the lesser of the two. When you compare it to the East, though, it's a totally different story, and you start getting really interesting stories in that regard. A third area that would be fascinating to look at is the impact of unification on East German artists. You know, the rents suddenly rising and people losing their studios and just the struggles to survive in Germany, the new Germany, after the wall fell. And how many artists who were practicing in 1988 were still practicing in 1995, and how had it affected their work? How were they engaging with these issues in their artwork? So I think all of that would be also a fascinating topic to explore. I think the practices of origin really for East Germany is the tension between socialist realism and modern art. And you have one that's being imposed from without, coming from the Soviet Union. You have the other that's actually coming from within, because of course East Germany was part of Germany until 1945. And ultimately what happens is the kind of native traditions of modernism, of German expressionism, of Neue Sachlichkeit, of these political artists of the 1920s are hugely important in German art, in East German art, I mean, and that they ultimately, the artists kind of take control and over a couple of decades finally kind of change the definition of socialist realism in East Germany from being a kind of a didactic emphasis on style to in fact being engagement with the audience. And so socialist realism is actually on the books almost until the very end of East Germany, and yet what you're seeing in official art in the 70s and 80s doesn't match what we in the West expect from socialist realism, this style of optimism, figuration, and heroicism. So certainly there's a global art world to talk about. We have major museums and major galleries like Gagosian with locations not only in the United States and Europe, but now in Asia, in Middle East, especially Abu Dhabi, in South America. You have art fairs and biennales in which art then is traveling on this global level. That said, it's a very limited number of artists, art critics, and people who can participate in that. And that's really kind of the 1%, if you will. And the vast majority of artists, I think, are focusing much more on a national context. And I think talking about it international is is a better concept than global for most artists because they're engaging with the national, engaging with the local. And in terms of East German artists, they were absolutely engaging with the German traditions of Expressionism, Neue Sachlichkeit, and the political artists of the 1920s. They were also engaging very much with the local. In Dresden, for example, Kurt Werner and Hans Grundig, and these artists were hugely important, and that plays a role. And Günter Grass once said that they paint more German in the GDR, and they did because those traditions were so important. Certainly. Visibility is key. And for East Germany, it struggles with the fact that it doesn't exist anymore. It disappears in 1990, and so it's often left out of discussions of Eastern and Central European art. It's fantastic that the CMAP project is engaging with East German art, but oftentimes it's left out because it's just kind of this anomalous situation, and it no longer exists. And so you no longer really either have the champions. We have a second issue with East German art, which is not only does it no longer exist as a country, but its artwork is no longer visible. The vast majority of East German art, not all, but the majority is in fact in Germany, and most of it's in Eastern Germany. And so you have these outstanding collections in Eastern Germany, and they're not being shown. And that's because the curators there are uncomfortable with it. Those who want to show the work don't feel they have the support to do so, and a lot of people don't want to show the work. They don't think it's valuable, and so they're falling into that kind of Cold War narrative that dismisses artistic production in East Germany.